Psychoanalysis and homosexuality. Namaste. Homosexuality is contested area in psychoanalysis and society. However, discussion on this area is more cultural and political and less from psychoanalytical standpoint. We will discuss the area today with psychoanalysis consultant Mr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, sir. So, can we start with prevalence of homosexuality in our conventional social response?
Historically, we can look at the response to homosexuality in different historical periods, and that gives us quite an idea about how it has evolved. Pre-civilization, it was considered as one of the characteristics of human beings, but nothing that was specially focused upon either positively or negatively.
Okay.
So just as people are creative, people are noble, people are evil, people are straightforward, people are twisted, similarly people can be heterosexual, bisexual or homosexual. Just one of the characteristics, nothing special about it. So that was the situation in pre-civilized human societies. Once civilization came in and people started getting together in groups and they started thinking about how best to survive individually and as a group.
Right.
Then the process started of thinking how best the survival of the group and the greatest general good can be achieved. And this created a need for able-bodied young men, because in those times the children could not protect the group, the old men could not protect the group, young women were mostly pregnant most of the time because there were no contraceptives.
Right.
And therefore the task of protecting the group from nature and from animals dawned upon the able-bodied young man. So with that came the necessity to have as many able-bodied young men in the group as possible. And this was possible only with heterosexual relationships, because homosexual relationships won't produce children who could grow out to become able-bodied young men. So with civilization, the focus started shifting on heterosexuality. But even at that moment, it was still a question of good and better. It was not a question of good and evil. So homosexuality was still not looked upon with a moral lens. This continued for some time till the institution of marriage came.
Okay.
And with the institution of marriage, because the institution of marriage is centered around exclusive rights given to individuals over each other. Because the core of the marriage means that individuals inside the marriage are more closely related to each other. They have more rights over each other compared to rights of people outside of that family unit. Now this created a situation where the privileging of heterosexuality became even more, because homosexual marriages could not produce children. And heterosexual situation was such that if one of them was a homosexual, the other person was in trouble. So the family members wanted that both the people should be heterosexual and they should produce as many able-bodied young men as possible.
Right.
So that was the idea, to save the group, save the family first and the group later, from nature and from animals. And later on, as group rivalry started for control of resources for survival and pleasure, the task of protecting the family, the group, was not only versus nature and animals, but also versus other groups. So what happened there was, this became even more intense, the privileging of heterosexuality, which can produce able-bodied young men, over homosexuality. but still we
Right,
did
right.
not have the moral part of it. It was a more utilitarian judgment and not a moral judgment.
Mhm.
And this continues till the advent of Christianity in Europe.
Okay.
Because even in the pre-Christian Roman times in Europe, this was not so much of a moral issue. In fact, in some of the writings, we find that a Roman king is described as a strange person who is not interested in men at all. So that was not so much of a moral issue at that time as much issue of personal choice and utilitarian decision making. But with the advent of Christianity, a new kind of morality came in. And with this new morality came in monogamy and the moral way of looking at homosexuality and heterosexuality.
Right, right.
And this spread during colonialism to the rest of the world. And even today we are in the grip of the same paradigm, even though within the paradigm we may not agree with the paradigm.
Mhm.
So this is a situation, and therefore it's very difficult for us even to imagine how a pre-Christian world was. Because even in countries which are not essentially Christian countries, the Christian worldview with respect to morality or homosexuality is prevailing all over the world today.
Right, right.
In the East, situation was very different till the colonial masters came in and brought the Christian virtues.
Mhm.
So in India and the East, the by and large, uh, a very utilitarian approach to homosexuality continued. And it was not something to be labeled as evil and you have to burn the person at the stake. Nothing of that sort ever happened in the East. This
Right, right.
persecution is a gift of the colonialism. It is the
Mhm.
colonialism which brought in those Victorian virtues and Christian virtues and put in persecution in the East.
Okay.
So the persecution started from that point in the East. Otherwise, there were very open societies and groups. Not only people could live in society, but create groups where different people could live differently with different orientations.
Right.
Many of the tantric group that we see in the past were open to homosexuality.
Mhm.
Yeah, they would create their own group a few kilometers outside the village because their practices were different. Not only homosexuality, but practices related to animal killing and so on.
Okay.
But these groups, these groups were never persecuted. People accepted them to be different, but the difference was not something which was termed as moral evil. So today we have a situation where uh, the Victorian virtues continued to color our thinking and imagination till almost recently, when homosexuality was persecuted. And in early Christianity and even today in many Islamic countries, there are punishments for homosexuality, including in some countries the punishment of death.
Mhm.
And if we look at early versions of DSM, early versions of DSM also classify homosexuality as a disease.
Mhm.
It was only in the recent DSMs that we don't find the mention of homosexuality as a problem.
Right, right.
Otherwise, in the chapter on sex-related mental disorders, you would have homosexuality as one of them.
Oh, okay. I see.
So I think almost till DSM 2 or 3, I don't know 4, but till at least 2 or 3, I think it was there. So this is a very social issue and very cultural issue. And the responses to homosexuality have been very different. When we look at the evolution of DSM, with that, the pendulum has shifted from one extreme to the other.
Mhm.
So what has happened today is, from saying that homosexuality is a disease to saying homosexuality is completely a choice and there is no aspect of constitution or no aspect of defensive psychoanalytic mechanisms.
Right, right.
We have shifted from one extreme to the other extreme, but the truth is more nuanced in between. And we will discuss this truth as we go along, but this is how it has evolved. And in psychoanalysis and psychiatry both, the treatment was different. In
Okay.
psychoanalysis, the treatment was far more charitable and supportive and accepting compared to psychiatry.
Okay.
And if we look at today the survey, how much percent of population is homosexual in orientation, and the definition there is those who actively practice it, or those who are strongly intent upon practicing it, or those who have compulsive fantasies most of the time. Compulsive homosexual fantasies most of the time. If this is the definition of homosexuality, then different surveys give us different figures. An average comes to around 7% of the population. And people say that because when you do such a survey, few people are ready to come out openly. So the real figure might be 10 to 12%.
Right, right.
But somewhere between 7 to 10% seems to lie the real figure. Now the question comes, is it only a social issue? Is it only an individual issue, or is it something to do with biology also?
Okay.
And that takes us to studies of animals. Then is homosexuality strictly a human issue, or is it found in animals also? And if we find it in animals also, then what is the percentage that we find in animals?
Right, right.
Because that allows us to study the constitutional parameter far more strongly in its own strength. Because the psychological individuality and the social conditioning in animal species is very low compared to human beings.
Right, right, right.
So there we find that it is present in animals also, mammals, the other mammals also. So there is a biological aspect to it without doubt.
Right.
It's not only a personal choice or a social construct, there is a biological issue to it.
Okay.
Second, the percentages always are low. The percentages are always less than 10%. So even in mammalian study, we don't find species where this would go up to 50%, 60% or 40% or come near heterosexuality.
Okay.
So nature also seems to prefer that mode of sexual behavior which produces the species rather than that mode which does not produce the species.
Right.
So that is where okay, so this is where the studies lead us, that number one, it has a biological root. It is not just choice. It is not just conditioning. Two, it is always in a minority. It is less than 10%. So it is always an exception, never a rule. The rule always is to go to channel sexuality in a direction where it can lead to the survival of species through reproduction.
Right, right.
So to say that there is nothing biological about it is wrong. To say that it is a rule and human culture has turned it into exception also is wrong. But to say that it can be rooted out completely also is wrong. So between all these fanatically extreme positions, the flow of truth is between all of them.
Right, right. So I'm just curious to know, how has psychoanalysis engaged with homosexuality?
This is very interesting because people attack Freud for the way he talked about homosexuality.
Okay.
Freud called homosexuality a perversion.
Mm-hmm.
And today it is not politically correct, and people attack him for almost persecuting homosexuals and not allowing the normal human rights to them.
Mm-hmm.
So they almost see it as an attack of patriarchy.
Okay.
But we have to go deeper into it by what Freud meant and how the definition of homosexuality in normal discourse is different from that in psychoanalytic discourse.
Okay.
So when Freud says perversion, he means it is an aberration. It does not mean it needs to be persecuted.
Okay.
I mean, the two are different. He is calling an exception an exception. He is not asking for that to be persecuted.
Mm-hmm.
So for Freud, anything that does not lead to reproduction is a perversion. And he went to great lengths in discussing how far foreplay and afterplay could be called normal and how far they could be called as perversions.
Okay.
Psychoanalytic understanding of perversion also includes the transgression of limits of reasonable reality. And Lacan defines perversion in a very interesting way. He says perversion is refusal to get castrated.
Okay.
And if we don't want to go insane, if we don't want to go psychotic, we have to accept castration.
Okay.
Right? And he says that the neurotic and the psychotic are different in a way that the neurotic is trying to refuse castration, whereas the psychotic is incapable of castration.
Okay.
And sanity demands castration. So Lacan uses a very different typology to divide all sicknesses into neurotic sicknesses, psychotic sicknesses, and perversion.
Mm-hmm.
So if you create a DSM based upon Lacan, you would have 3 sections: neurotic sicknesses, psychotic sicknesses, and perversions.
Okay.
So perversion is a transgression of reasonable limits of reality. It's refusal to accept the reasonable limitations of reality. And therefore, the use of the word perversion in psychoanalysis is slightly different from that in normal discourse.
Right. Right.
And for Freud, it was the purposiveness that if sexuality does not lead to reproduction, which was intended by nature, it is a perversion. That does not mean that a person is insane and needs to be brought back to sanity or needs to be persecuted. That was not the meaning at all. But people stretch the word perversion to persecution, which was never intended by Freud. It's a wrong stretch of the word perversion to persecution.
Okay.
And this is happening in the minds of the readers, right? On the extreme left, it never happened in Freud's mind. So this is one important element of the point that Freud talked about it as perversion, number one. Number two, what would Freud say about homosexuality? So for Freud, all individuals were bisexual. The entire human race was bisexual. And the situation was that every human being was either an active bisexual or a passive bisexual. And therefore, because we see only a small percentage of people as active bisexuals or active homosexuals, for others, the question was of accepting the bisexuality, integrating it so that there is no rage towards one's own homosexuality or bisexuality, by which person does not punish himself through some mechanism of guilt, or this rage is not turned outwards towards somebody who is then persecuted.
Right, right.
Freud went to the extent of saying that repressed homosexuality is the cause for paranoia.
Oh,
And the mechanism he said was, I love you, I hate you, I hate you, I will kill you, I will kill you, you will kill me. Defense is operating at every level, finally resulting in paranoia that somebody is going to attack me.
right,
So this is how Freud used to engage with it. For Freud, this was a universal phenomena, bisexuality. It had to be accepted, and those who were not active were latent, and for those who were latent, this has to be accepted, integrated, brought out in the awareness, so that it does not turn attack on oneself or attack on other.
right, right.
There is a difference, however, in the real world. We'll see it later how Freud's views need to be further refined. But this was Freud's view. Klein, by and large, continued with Freud's view. And for her also, it was essentially a bisexual constitution she was dealing with. You created a very nuanced understanding of it. So you differentiated between masculinity and femininity, and the conversion of masculinity and femininity into sexual orientation. So for you, the masculinity and femininity were present in every individual. It was universal.
Okay.
But that universality was much wider in the sense masculinity did not only mean a masculine orientation in sexual activity, but masculinity also was related to assertiveness, to power, to taking risk, to logic, to obedience of law. Right? It was the entire spectrum of logos which was masculine, and the entire spectrum of eros was the feminine.
Okay.
So masculinity and femininity for you were not confined that these two would lead only to sexual outcomes, but they were present in all areas of human affairs. So for him, the integration of masculinity and femininity was very important. So he accepted that masculinity and femininity was present in everyone, but he would not convert this to say that everyone was bisexual.
Okay.
So for him, the definition was by and large what definition we have today, that unless somebody is actively bisexual or homosexual or strongly wants to be one because one is pushed in that direction or fantasies are mostly in that direction, if these things are not there, we don't call people bisexuals or homosexuals. We don't say that those who are not actively homosexual or bisexual and those who don't want to be and those who don't have compulsive fantasies are latent bisexuals. We don't use that definition. So Jung's definition was by and large the definition that we have today, that either one is actively practicing it or actively wants to practice it, or the fantasies are of bisexual, homosexual nature. So for Jung, it was that kind of situation. Today we have a more elaborate understanding, and psychoanalytic understanding is slightly away from the political understanding in society. It has become a issue of political correctness. So now we have extreme political opinions which have hijacked the social discourse. So now you can't even say that there can be anything like healing homosexuality. So today the extreme position is it is not a sickness at all. It does not have to be healed at all. It's just a personal choice.
Okay, right.
The psychoanalytic understanding is slightly nuanced. In psychoanalysis, we find two kinds of homosexual or bisexual behavior: natural and defensive. Natural is where by orientation one is born that way. and defensive where because of certain traumatic events, the person has shifted from heterosexuality to homosexuality.
Right, right.
And when we look at that traumatic shifting, then like all traumas, this trauma also has to be healed. And once that healing happens, the person is still free to continue with homosexuality. But that choice will be really a free choice, free from the traumatic events. So
Right.
today we look at, personally, I at least look at homosexuality in this way, that there is a natural homosexuality and there is a defensive homosexuality. And the defensive homosexuality needs to be healed with psychoanalysis or any other form of therapy. And once the person is healed, the person is still free to make the same choice. But I don't agree with the position that there's nothing like defensive homosexuality and therefore there's never anything to be healed. So there are cases of natural homosexuality where it is true there's nothing to be healed. But there are cases of defensive homosexuality where there are things to be healed. So this extreme position that it is a sickness or it is not a sickness at all, both these extreme positions are wrong. In case of natural homosexuality, it is not a sickness at all, there's nothing to be healed. But in defensive homosexuality, from a psychoanalytic standpoint, it is a sickness. It may not be a sickness from DSM standpoint. But from a psychoanalytic standpoint, it is a sickness to be healed. So the person is freed for a real free choice.
Right, right. Okay. And in terms of mechanism, how is homosexuality understood in psychoanalysis?
When we take up natural homosexuality, the situation is very clear that the contrasexual psychological component was stronger than the same gender psychological component. Meaning, in a man, there is femininity and masculinity. In woman also, there is femininity and masculinity. Now, let us say in a man, the femininity is more than the masculinity. So the biological body is of male, but psychologically the femininity is more.
Right, right.
So that would inevitably lead to a bisexual or a homosexual orientation. So this is a natural course. Now, in the natural course, what happens, right? Now, for there, we will have to look at the absolute strength of each of them and the relative strength of each of them. How orientation gets determined. So let us say you have a man, your man M1. On a 10-point scale, masculinity is at 8 and femininity is at 5. So masculinity is higher than femininity and there is adequate difference between the two.
Correct.
This would be a classical heterosexual constitution. Now think of another man. On a 10-point scale, masculinity is at 9 and femininity is at 8. So in absolute terms, the masculinity is very high. But the femininity also is very high and the difference between them is very low.
Low, yes, correct.
When this is the situation, you may easily find a bisexual constitution. And let us take a third person, M3. He is a man by body, by biological outlook of him. But inside of him, femininity is at 7 and masculinity is at 3. So it is very clearly a natural homosexual constitution. So this would be the way the natural homosexuality would get determined. The absolute masculinity or femininity and the difference between the masculinity and the femininity related to the biological gender of the person.
Okay.
This is the natural form of it. Right? That whenever the non-biological psychological gender is higher side and the difference between the two is lower, it can get into bisexuality or homosexuality.
Right.
Now look at the defensive part of it. Let us say a person gets stuck in the Oedipus and the fear of the Oedipus is very high. So whenever the person thinks of heterosexual situation, the castration anxiety comes up.
Right. Right.
And because of that, the person shifts from heterosexuality to homosexuality to avoid the castration anxiety.
Oh.
Situation 2. The person is able to give up the Oedipal object, but the emotional loss involved in giving up the Oedipus object is very high. So the person comes out of the Oedipus not with castration anxiety, but with repressed pain, unbearable repressed pain. So this would again not allow the person to go into heterosexual relationships because of the fear of similar pain again happening.
Right. Right.
Think of the split being open and the mother not being available and the person feeling extreme pain. And if it is a boy child, the person may decide not to have heterosexual relationships in future to avoid the same pain. Think of another situation. A person gets into heterosexual relationships but repeatedly fails, and every time the pain is unbearable. And after 4 or 5 attempts, the person just gives up heterosexual relationships and moves towards homosexual relationships or bisexual relationships.
Oh, okay.
Now, this is more common in India in women with high masculinity scores than in men. But all these are the forms of defensive movement towards bisexuality or homosexuality. Take another example from Winnicott's point of view. A good enough mother is not available, and the son decides not to get close to women again because of the same experience. Or the mother is too suffocating and trauma causing. So whenever a person thinks of heterosexual relationship, the trauma, the suffocation and the entrapment comes in and the person runs for his life. So all of these are cases where there is a defensive movement to bisexuality or homosexuality, and this defensive movement needs psychoanalytic healing.
Right.
Or any form of healing for that matter.
Correct. Got it.
So this is the way psychoanalysis would look at both the forms of natural homosexuality and defensive homosexuality. And defensive homosexuality definitely needs to be healed.
Right. So how can we explore if it is natural or defensive?
There are many ways of looking. It's a very good question and difficult question. Because this is the question that any person who comes to you will ask in therapy. That is my homosexuality natural or is it defensive? How do I know? Because this is a central point whether to go for therapy or not go for therapy. If the homosexuality is natural, there is no therapy needed. But if the homosexuality is defensive, then of course there is a need for therapy. So it's difficult answer to give, but the way to answer is through some of these points, which I would say take as indicative, not prescriptive. First, what is the age of onset? If the age of onset is after 35, on an average, and I'm using the word average very liberally, on an average, the chances of somebody being in defensive homosexuality are more. Natural homosexuality would make its appearance very soon, mostly after puberty.
Right.
And even if somebody is in a very repressive environment, culturally speaking, it would definitely make an advent in the age group of 25 to 35.
Mm-hmm.
But very rare that it would make an appearance after 35.
Okay.
Of course, we cannot say absolutely that it cannot be happen, but in majority of cases it will not happen.
Right, right.
Second would be the way the body appears. Because in many cases, most cases of natural homosexuality, the body would have those characteristics. So
Mm-hmm.
a woman appearing to be very masculine and strong, a man appearing to be very effeminate and having very less hair, or an
Okay.
ultra smooth shining skin like a woman, or a more globular body structure than the linear structure of a man, or certain
Mm-hmm.
peculiar uh, shapes that
Mm-hmm.
intuitively other homosexuals would pick up upon.
Mm-hmm.
So these are some indicative, but not, I would not say they are diagnostic, but indicative uh, entities to look out for. Number one. Number two, uh, the position they take in the homosexual couple. Like in the homosexual couple, the one who acts a woman, that does not create any uh, dichotomy. The femininity
Mm-hmm.
is very high. He wants to be a woman and he is acting like a woman.
Right.
But what about the person who acts a male in the homosexual couple? If he wants to act a male, why doesn't he act a male in a heterosexual context? Why does he come here to act as a male?
Correct, correct.
And that gives rise to more probability of a defensive homosexuality. And the third and the most important point is the case history, of course. The case history
Okay.
will tell you whether trauma is involved, from which this turn could be taken, or is it just a natural flow of events?
Mm-hmm.
If we see trauma, then definitely we have to investigate if or not this orientation turn happens after the trauma.
Right,
So
right.
these are some of the ways in which we can explore the very important element, whether it is natural or defensive, because on this decision is based the further important decision whether it has to be healed in therapy or it is just the natural way the person is.
Correct, correct. And is psychoanalytic position today different from your personal position?
Yeah, what I have stated till now is actually my personal position. The psychoanalytic position is the politically correct position. I think I should clarify it now that in your answer to how psychoanalysis looks at it, I have actually told how I look at it. So
Mm-hmm.
the absolute masculinity and femininity, the difference between the two, the concept of natural and the defensive, these are more of my concepts other than pure psychoanalytic concepts.
Mm-hmm. Right, right.
Some old school psychoanalytic thinkers may still be thinking on my lines, or maybe I am thinking on their lines. But the classical psychoanalytic position today is the politically correct position that it is just a choice and there is nothing to be healed.
Mm-hmm.
So this is more of a politically correct choice that today psychoanalysts make. Otherwise, whether it is Freud or Jung or many of old school psychoanalysts or people like me, we have a different take on the issue, which is not the same as the politically correct shouting that you're finding nowadays on the college campuses.
Mm-hmm.
Shouting loudly politically is not science. You can shout anything that you want. So it is one thing to have influence in public discourse and another thing whether you are scientifically correct or not correct.
Mhm.
And the philosophical position, of course, is of inclusion and non-persecution. But that does not mean covering up something traumatic and defensive and not calling what needs to be healed as something that needs to be healed.
Mhm. Right. The last question I need to ask you: how have ancient cultures been dealing with homosexuality? Is there anything culture can do to reduce it?
Yeah. I mean, by reduce it, I'm sure you mean the suffering that comes from it. Yeah. Uh, uh, Ancient cultures have dealt with it very differently than the culture today, which has actually an outcome of the colonial export of Victorian values.
Mhm.
So in India and in China, it was essentially seen as a play of masculinity and femininity.
Mhm.
And one of the reasons for any couple, apart from the sexual attraction and many utilitarian objectives, was
Mhm.
to have this feeling of being whole,
Mhm.
like two jigsaw puzzles psychologically coming together and creating this whole, this yin and yang, or the masculinity and femininity.
Right. Right.
And the experience of wholeness is a very important objective of any two people relating, especially in the romantic relationship.
Mhm.
That the masculinity of the one and the femininity of the other that gets together and
Okay.
creates the feeling of the whole. So
Mhm.
in India and China, it was looked upon as a very important yin and yang interaction, or masculinity and femininity interaction, or Shiva and Shakti interaction.
Mhm.
And there are complete schools on how this interaction can be understood and managed. So if you look into spiritual schools which are based on uh, Shakti Upasana, right? Or which are based on many tantric schools which are related to the feminine aspect,
Mhm.
you will see, and many Chinese schools also which are based upon yin yang togetherness and wholeness.
Okay.
And you read much about it and brought some part of it into his thinking. You can see a full expansion of definition of femininity and masculinity. So if you look at the
Okay.
Chinese explanation, it is not limited to human beings.
Mhm.
So it is a philosophical aspect of masculinity and femininity. For
Right. Right.
example, uh, anything which is strong and stable is thought of to be masculine. Anything which is fluid and flowing is thought of to be feminine.
Mhm.
So the flow of a river, right, is thought of to be feminine. The mountain is thought of to be masculine. Now, there is
Right. Right.
nothing gender oriented about it. There is nothing sexual about it. There is nothing human about it.
Mhm.
It's a philosophical way of understanding the whole of creation in terms of two categories of values. One
Right. Right.
category is that which is stable, strong, and logical and consistent, and the other which is fluid, flowing, creative, and nurturing.
Mhm.
So eros is on one side, logos is on the other side.
Okay.
Law is on one side, openness and nurturing and love is on the other side.
Mhm.
So that has nothing to do with gender orientation, romantic relationship, or a human person. It's a philosophical system where the universe is attempted to be understood as a play of the masculine and feminine. And that when you
Mhm.
reduce down to the human affairs and human beings, you get into masculinity in human beings and femininity in human beings, and then you narrate that or relate that to their sexual orientation.
Right. Right.
So that was a very different way of looking at uh, femininity and masculinity, then the current discourse which is going on in that. One second explanation, apart from this philosophical explanation, is the explanation of reincarnation. That because of certain way you have been reincarnated in the past, you have this particular orientation in this particular incarnation. So from a Hindu philosophical standpoint, or many schools which subscribe to the Hindu philosophical standpoint, the sexual orientation is seen as a part of a larger reincarnational process, where somehow there have been an equal number or a comparable number of births in either of the genders, and now you have a bisexual orientation, or you want to experience both the feminine side and the masculine side together, and therefore the soul has chosen a bisexual orientation. Or to say that the soul wanted to experience what it is like to have a male body but a female mind all together. And therefore the soul has chosen this. So the explanation there is very different. And when we have this kind of explanation, persecution goes out of the window. It's very descriptive and a very spiritual way and a very respectful way of approaching it. Very interestingly, the Romans used to use it in a very interesting way. What they would do is they would put those people in the army who had homosexual relationships with other soldiers in the same unit. And because they would fight together, it was almost like a soldier fighting with his wife or the child next to him in the battlefield. And the Romans found that they were fighting more ferociously to save themselves and the partner. Rather than fighting alone in two different units when the partner was not in front of them. So saving the partner led to more ferocity and more sustenance and fortitude. So this was the way they used it. And the yogic and the philosophical Eastern way is to accept both this masculinity and femininity and integrate them. So integration does not mean a walkover from a hetero constitution to a bisexual constitution. It means integrating the best of the two in the overall natural constitution, whatever that is. So the Eastern and the ancient way is acceptance and integration, and being whatever one is, and through that move into some sort of spiritual progress.
So thank you. It was an educative journey to steer clear from shouting gates and walk on the paths of bridges and walks on the path of knowledge on the subject. Do write to us at hbindia@gmail.com. Namaste.
Namaste.